One of the things I'm most passionate about as an athlete and as a coach is helping people realize just how little time they actually have to spend to get great results if they have a plan, if they train hard, and if they know what they're doing. And I can't think of a better example of that principle than core training. It's one of those things where I see people spinning their wheels, doing 30+ minutes of core warm-up and ab exercises per session, and still not getting the results they want, still not having the physique they want. And so the purpose of this video is to share with you a few of my favorite exercises and guiding principles so that you can get shredded abs, have a super strong core, in as little as 15 minutes per week. I know that sounds like a big promise, but I truly think that if you know how to train hard, have proper exercise selection, and know how to do these exercises well, I truly think you're gonna be able to get better results than you've ever gotten in probably less time than you've ever committed. So the first function of the core that we're gonna talk about and show exercises for is just basic forward flexion. So when it comes to forward flexion, that's gonna be your rectus abdominis or your classic six-pack muscles. So these ones here. And a lot of times when it comes to training the rectus abdominis or the six-pack, people will ask about training the upper abs versus the lower abs and that sort of thing. So I'm gonna share with you what we do know and what we're unsure about and where some of the gaps in the research is and how that relates to some of the exercises that I'm gonna show you today. So in terms of actual ability to bias or train upper abs versus lower abs, there's not that much that we can actually do. They're all innervated together. So you can't selectively activate upper or lower abs independent of one another, but you can see regional changes in length. So depending on what exercise I do, I can see more length change in one region of the abs than in the other. So hypothetically, we could make a mechanistic argument for the ability to slightly bias or slightly favor upper versus lower abs. But in terms of what that translates to in terms of actual hypertrophy outcomes and are there special exercises you need to do to blow up your lower abs, we can't really say that so much. But when it comes to specificity, being good at certain exercises as opposed to others, I think that matters. And so we're gonna talk about different exercises for the rectus abdominis or the six-pack that are gonna focus more on the kind of the rib cage portion. So upper abs, and then exercises that focus more on the lumbopelvic control or the lower abs. What I wanna make clear though is that when I say upper abs and lower abs, I'm not suggesting that we're gonna be able to really selectively grow just those muscles or just these muscles. It's just reflective of where are we gonna see a little bit more movement and a little bit more length change. Maybe that translates slightly to where you get sore or where you feel it the most, but by and large, all of these exercises are gonna grow and train the entire six-pack. So when we think about the upper abs, or kind of the more rib cage dominant portion of trunk flexion, you can think about just your basic kind of crunching exercise. So the rib cage is changing shape a lot. It's gonna be these upper abs that are contracting and changing shape a little bit more. On the other hand, when we think of kind of lower abs or lumbopelvic kind of hip control, that's gonna be more of a legs first sort of situation like that. Again, both of those are training the entirety of the six-pack. The whole thing is contracting together. It's just where are you gonna see a little bit more length change? Are you seeing the length change more here or the length change more here, or both, potentially at the same time? So my favorite exercise for training kind of the upper abs, if you will, or getting more rib cage movement, is gonna be just a basic crunch. I'm gonna show you a couple of variations of it and my favorite options for loading it up. Ideally, you can have an ab mat or something like that, because you want something that's gonna allow your spine and rib cage to get a little bit more length. So I'm getting a little more curvature here compared to if I was just on the flat bench like that. If you don't have access to an ab mat, you can roll up a pad or something like that, or potentially, turn this way on the bench so you're able to arch over it. But ideally, you're finding something that's going to give you a little bit more shape change or length change. Once you're set up with your preferred variation, getting some good length change here, we're going to add some weight to it. Now, the most common way to load this that I have seen is people just putting a weight on their chest like that. And that's totally fine. Sometimes I see people, they'll do this and they'll kind of throw the weight or allow the weight to roll down as they do the exercise. I would avoid that because then you're gonna end up needing a really, really heavy weight because you're mostly using momentum versus just keeping the weight still. But even more than that, my preferred option is actually to go for more of an overhead reach and then crunch, just because the leverage then makes that really challenging. You only need, most people anyway, 5-10 pounds is gonna feel like a pretty significant challenge versus having to load up a really heavy dumbbell and have the feeling of doing a lot of work, but a lot of it could just be momentum. So that overhead variation is probably my favorite for just basic forward trunk flexion, like so, making sure you're keeping the arms steady and in line with the torso, as opposed to throwing the arms to get up. Now, to make clear the difference between more rib cage or kind of upper ab, upper trunk focus work versus lower kind of hip control and hip flexor engagement, to show you the difference between those two things, and to show you kind of the opposite movement. And that's gonna be something like this, where I brace on, keep the top half of my body still, and then I'm just curling from the bottom. So when you do this exercise, the most common thing that people will do to make it easier is they'll throw their legs up and use a lot of momentum, which definitely makes it easy, and you're gonna get some hip flexor contribution to that. But if you wanna keep it a little bit more core focused, try not to change that hip flexion angle and only work on curling up through the abs themselves. So I'm just gonna hold my legs straight here and then lift up. I could do the same thing here, lifting up with minimal momentum. To reiterate, both of those exercises are gonna be great for the entire length of your 6-pack or your 8-pack, your rectus abdominis, but you might feel just a very subtle difference in where you get the most stretch and what other muscles are helping you out. So you don't have to do both of those exercises in the same session, but they are both valid options. Now, if you want that second exercise to be a little tougher, you can just incline the bench a little, and then same thing. Now you're just fighting against gravity a little bit more to get up there. Now, I've shown you variations of these exercises just on the bench here. If you have access to a GHD, other fancier, higher end core training equipment, you can certainly do that. But you don't need anything super fancy, I think, to get a great workout from those two variations. Now, if I had to pick one, rib cage, kind of upper trunk flexion versus more lower trunk and hip flexion, I wouldn't, because you can do both. You can do both at the same time. So that exercise that I'm gonna show you next works great if you have a stability ball. So we've talked about how you can have exercises that are a little bit more focused on movement in the rib cage at the upper half of the trunk, and exercises where you're seeing a little bit more movement down at the hips and the lumbar spine. You can also do both of those things at the same time. And so if I had to pick one exercise that I love the most, just for complete kind of front trunk development, six-pack, rectus abdominis development, it would be this. This exercise you can do on a GHD machine if you have access to one of those, but it also works great just with something like a Swiss ball. So I'll show you this one and a few other variations you can do with minimal equipment. With this variation, using the Swiss ball, I like having either a bench or a wall or something like that, just to kind of stabilize the knees a little bit. The Swiss ball on its own, if I roll back a little bit here, I can wiggle around, my knees are moving, that kind of thing. But if I roll into that bench, I'm just a little bit more secure. You're also gonna want something to anchor your feet or your knees. I think the most comfortable and most stable way to do that is just to grab like a really heavy dumbbell, something at least half your body weight, and then set it on your knees like so. So I'm anchored down. I have some additional support this way, so I'm not generally gonna move anywhere. And then from there, I can go back into this fully stretched position, get great range of motion, and then come up. So I'm gonna show you a couple different technique variations on this. They're all great ab exercises. There's pros and cons to each, and then I'll show you the one that I like the most. So to review kind of this idea of just upper trunk movement, we have this here where I'm getting more length change in the upper abs, more contribution in some of the intercostal muscles on the ribs as well. And if you watch my hips here, as I do this movement, my hips are not moving at all. On the other hand, I can keep my kind of ribs and back on the stability ball, and I can tilt my pelvis, I can arch my back, and I'm getting a lot of movement kind of and length change in the lower abs, little engagement in the hip flexors, and then I can also do both at the same time. So to get both going at the same time, which is my preferred variation, I'm gonna think about kind of wrapping around this stability ball and arching my back, or really trying to kind of stick my butt out as much as I can. And then when I come up, I'm not just lifting the chest, I'm also curling the hips, trying to close the space between the bottom of my ribs and the top of my pelvis as much as possible. So I'm creating length from both sides and then shortening that space from both sides. Now there's a couple ways that people will quote unquote cheat this exercise. Not so much cheating as much as just bringing other muscle groups in to assist. And that really is the difference between a true crunch and a full sit-up. So when I'm doing that crunch and kind of moving from both the rib cage and the hips, my butt and my hips are gonna stay up in the air. Whereas if I let the hips come up and then let the hips come down, I've sat all the way up, and you'll see at the top of this, my spine's actually pretty straight. I'm not really crunched. I haven't really created a lot of compression here. I'm just upright. And so when you do something like that, this more sit-up type motion, you're bringing in a lot of just hip flexor shortening and not as much length change, across the rib cage. Not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you want to load the hip flexors more and have more of a full body exercise or full core exercise where abs and hip flexors are doing things. You can generally load that heavier. I could take a fairly heavy weight for that full sit-up variation, whereas for more of that crunch variation, a little bit more isolated, I'm not gonna be able to handle something quite as heavy. Again, the true crunch, great ab exercise, more of the sit-up variation or bringing more hip flexor into it, still a great variation. But I'd say if you're really looking to add variability to your training program and develop the strongest core that you possibly can, I think having the ability or the capacity to isolate trunk movement when you want to is a great skill to have. And we're gonna see that show up in a lot of other different patterns like side bending and twisting as well. You can put your whole body into things sometimes, but I think being able to isolate and kind of separate motion of the rib cage versus motion of the hips versus motion of the legs is a good athletic skill that's going to translate into some other skills we'll talk about later. So we've already talked about trunk flexion or training that rectus abdominis. The next kind of movement pattern and muscle group that we're going to talk about is training movements like rotation and side bending, and how that best trains the obliques. So muscles through here and up onto the rib cage. Now you have two sets of obliques. You have what's called your internal obliques and your external obliques. As far as remembering which one is which, what exactly they do, I don't think it's that important. I'm not gonna get into too much anatomical jargon, but I think it's important to note that one, there's a lot of overlap in terms of what muscles contribute to rotation and what muscles contribute to lateral flexion. So at first glance, you could look at those movements and say, oh, they both train obliques. I only need one of those exercises. I don't have to do both. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. If you get really, really good at one of these exercises, there's probably going to be some carryover to the other and vice versa because they're both oblique exercises. That being said, I do think that you can bias or focus a little bit more on different portions of your oblique. If you look at the research, unfortunately, there's just not a lot of data. We have some EMG data, we have anatomical models and things like that. But when it comes to actual human outcome studies of, hey, how much did this person grow their internal oblique versus their external oblique from this exercise versus that exercise program, we just don't really have that data out there. So I can't look at you and say, I can prove that this exercise is going to hypertrophy this muscle more than the other. But based on some anatomical modeling, my own personal experience with how these exercises feel, I think we can make some pretty educated guesses. And I feel reasonably confident that training rotation and training side bending are going to give you pretty different results. So I think it's worth incorporating both to be as well-rounded as you can. Training rotation is really interesting because a lot of times when people go to train rotation, they end up accidentally training something else. And so I'm going to show you a couple different exercises that people will do and which ones I prefer and why. So a lot of times when people think of rotation, they think of just kind of any sort of full body twist. I'll see people do chops like this just with their arms. I'll see people turn their torso. I'll see people turn their entire body and their hips. And then you can also kind of ripple. So I'm moving from the feet first, then the hips, then the torso, then the arms. And so all of those are going to have the same effect on the weight over here. They're all in some way a twist. But in terms of what muscles are contributing, it's going to be quite different. So first, we're going to talk about true trunk rotation. So when I do a true twist, nothing else is moving except my rib cage relative to my hips. So I'm not moving my arms. I'm not turning my hips. I'm just rotating the spine and the rib cage. Everything else stays perfectly still. A lot of people struggle to do that well. They try to turn the rib cage, everything else kind of follows, or the hips start to drift along a little bit and they don't get a lot of what we call hip-shoulder separation or dissociation. And so training trunk rotation is a great way to train that ability to separate the hips and the rib cage. Working on separating the hips and the rib cage is how you train actual trunk rotation. So it goes both ways there. Why is it important? So you want to be able to separate the hips and the rib cage because if I try to put on, more weight on this exercise, if I try to do something really powerful and I try to just have everything moving together as one unit, you can see how that required a lot of strain. That was relatively difficult for me when I wasn't separating things out. But when I learned to move kind of feet and then hips and then trunk and then arms, this weight is actually light enough for me to throw and not get tired at all. But if I don't have that sequence or ability to separate it gets really quite heavy. So a lot of times as it relates to functional movement, sports, swinging a golf club, swinging a tennis racket, it's not always even about your core strength or your rotational strength in terms of isolated trunk rotation. It's about your ability to separate, sequence, time, and have that coordination. And so in my view, a lot of rotational training, it's not just about developing the strength, power, or hypertrophy of the obliques. It's about training the ability to separate and be able to move things independently. When you're trying to train the ability to separate the hips and the shoulders, I think it's important to have some sensory feedback that lets you know where your body is in space. All too often when I was a personal trainer, and I would tell my clients to just rotate their trunk, so I was looking for this motion, they would say, okay, I'm doing it. And as you can see here, my hips and trunk are moving together. And I'd say, no, don't move your hips, just rotate your trunk. And they would just keep doing the same thing. It wasn't until I used some sort of box or bench or something where they could feel where their hips were that they understood what that separation was really all about. So you can always bring someone down, to the ground. When you're a little bit lower to the ground, it's a little bit easier to know where your hips are in space. In this half kneeling stance, if things start to move or your hips start to move, you'll generally see like your knees shift or rock or something like that. So it's easier to get that true rotation because again, if I start rotating my hips, my knee is gonna fall in or something like that. And if even that is a challenge, you can even do something like a seated variation where the hips can't move at all because they're stuck to a bench or a box or something like that. But of all those variations, if I had to pick my favorite one, it's going to be the bent over cable chop. My favorite exercise for training isolated trunk rotation, both in terms of how heavy you can load it and how good it is at giving you some sensory feedback to know where your hips are in space, is gonna be the bent over cable chop or bent over cable rotation. You don't have to have a weight belt for this exercise, but I think it's really helpful to weight yourself down at the hips, not only because it keeps you from sliding around or if you're strong enough, potentially lifting yourself off the ground, but even if you're not using super heavy weight, just that sensory feedback of something pulling on your hips lets you know where those hips are. And so if you start to twist and turn and lose that hip shoulder separation, you're gonna have something pushing on you and letting you know kind of what's going on. So I recommend getting a really heavy weight, dumbbell, kettlebell, something like that. That weight is now pulling down on your hips. Take a nice wide stance. And then set up and start twisting. Now, again here, the goal is to rotate my torso, not just move the arms. That's probably the most common mistake I see, is people turn this into just an arm exercise and the torso doesn't move much. So you want to imagine that there's a laser beam shooting out of your chest, passing through your hands at all times. So when you twist, at all portions through the range of motion, that laser beam is going out of your chest, passing through your hands, rather than your hands being off to one side. Twisting as far as I can. Once I get here, this is as far as I can twist, I stop. So I'm not gonna let the arms keep going. I just stop right there. So with a cable chop exercise like this, you can set up in a variety of different positions. I can be right next to the cable stack, or I can be relatively far away from the cable stack. I could also change the height of where this pulley is. And that's gonna have one very important effect, and that is changing where in the exercise's range of motion does it feel the most challenging. So I'm gonna show you guys two very different variations of this same exercise. And we're gonna talk about why you would or wouldn't wanna challenge yourself in these different positions. So Let's see. So this first variation here, I'm gonna set up as close to the machine as I can. And in this variation, at this portion of the exercise, notice how there's essentially a right angle between my arms and the cable. So the cable is going straight up and down here, my arms are going straight out, and at this right angle, that weight feels the heaviest. When I twist, eventually I'm gonna get it to where the cable's in line with my arm, and I feel like I can hang out here, pretty much all day. So the exercise is really tough here, really easy here, really tough here, really easy here. That toughest position in this setup is the lengthened or stretched position. So when my obliques are fully stretched, the exercise feels the most challenging. On the other hand, if I scoot out this way, quite a bit from the machine, now I'm not gonna get to that same right angle between my arms and the cable until I'm almost at the bottom of the exercise. Now this is the toughest portion of the lift. Here, I can hang out here and talk all day, but it's closer to the bottom. I can't hang out here very long like I could before. So in that variation of the exercise, we would say that it's more the mid-range portion that is the most challenging. Both are valid ways to train the exercise. Typically when you load that lengthened position, you might get a little bit more sore. You're probably gonna do more to improve your mobility in that position, but it can be more challenging, more fatiguing. You're often stronger and will be able to lift more weight in that position. Whereas in more of that mid-range or neutral position, you're not gonna be able to lift quite as heavy generally on something like this, but you also might not get as sore. It might be more comfortable. Some people get like some pain or pinching at end range. So both are valid options, but just know that you can modify where that exercise feels most challenging just by moving around. So I mentioned before that you have two main oblique muscles, the external and the internal obliques. The internal obliques, they start down here near the hip, and they tend to attach on your lowermost ribs. For most people, they don't go much past the 10th rib or so. And then you have your external obliques that also start down low, but they go much higher up on the rib cage. So this bent over cable twist and other rotational exercises that you could do will typically make you a little bit more sore, at least in this portion kind of along the rib cage. Rotation involves a lot of rib cage movement. That is a little bit different than what we see with side bending or lateral flexion, where we see more length change in this portion kind of the lower internal obliques and also some of the muscles of the lower back. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there is a ton of overlap. So rotation, lateral flexion or side bending, both those exercises are gonna train all of your obliques, but you're probably gonna get a little bit more of those lower and internal obliques with side bending compared to the more upper and external obliques that we had with the rotation. So with a good side bend, the important thing, sort of like with the rotation discussion, is we want it to be true trunk lateral flexion as opposed to just a lean of the entire body. So a lot of times, especially if people go too heavy too soon and they try to do this movement, they end up just kind of leaning everything here versus getting a good bend and movement even into the rib cage as well. So again, you want to really laterally crunch and shorten that space between your armpit and your hip as much as you can, as opposed to just leaning everything to the side there. Now, just like we talked about with rotation, how I could make that exercise tougher in that more lengthened position, or I could make it tougher in the more shortened position. You can do the same thing with side bending. So I can set up, close to the machine, or I can use a free weight, and that's generally going to feel toughest closer to the bottom or stretched position, where if I scoot further away, that's going to be a little bit tougher in that shortened position. Or something like this variation here is still going to be pretty challenging even in that mid-range position. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet with all of these core exercises is the idea of axial compression. And it's kind of a hot topic in fitness, of managing axial fatigue or just like heavy weight on your back, and how if you have a heavy barbell on your back for back squats and deadlifts and all of those things, eventually that very specific type of fatigue will start to catch up with you, and you might want to not avoid it, but just manage it and try not to have too much of it across a single session or across a week. I'm not telling you that some of these core exercises are better or worse than others, but if you find yourself doing a program that involves a lot of compression, your back is feeling achy, you're feeling fatigued, there are options for these exercises that are a little bit less compressive in nature, but are still going to give you a really good muscular stimulus. One of my favorite examples of that is comparing the standing side bend or traditional like dumbbell side bend to the overhead side bend. So most people with a bit of training will be able to handle a really heavy load for something like a standing side bend. I can generally get up to about 200 pounds or so for that exercise. And if you think about, maybe doing 2 or 3 sets per side, that's a lot of time with a lot of weight in my hands on top of what I might already be doing with squats, deadlifts, etc. Contrast that 100 to 200 pound exercise to the overhead side bend, which I'm going to show you here. I reach overhead. I'm not making this challenging by using more weight. I'm making this challenging by making it a longer lever arm and placing that weight very far away. So here, you can see that even just 10 to 20 pounds on the machine is relatively challenging here, and can be a great option for loading up the obliques without having to use quite as heavy of a load. Up to this point, we've focused on muscles on the front side of the trunk, your rectus abdominis, your internal and external obliques, and so on. But there's also an entire backside of your trunk that people often don't give a lot of energy or discussion when it comes to core training. And in some cases, I think they're right, but we are going to talk about it a little bit. Back extension, essentially the ability to go from a flexed spine to an extended spine, is an important part of the trunk musculature. But just like we talked about the idea of redundancy on the front of the core and how side bending and rotation both kind of hit all of the obliques, but we can bias some of them versus others. When it comes to muscles on the back side of the trunk, your spinal erectors, your multifidus, those things, there's a ton of overlap and redundancy. So when we rotate, when we side bend, when we extend, we're essentially hammering the same muscles in the back of the trunk again and again and again. And those muscles, the erectors, multifidus, those muscles are already doing a ton of work in back squats, deadlifts, really anything where you're gonna have a lot of axial load, weight on your back, all that kind of stuff. Those muscles are getting a ton of stimulus. So when it comes to supplemental core training, I would put back extension and other things related kind of to the spine itself in more of the advanced category. It's not that it's insignificant or there's not things that we can do with it, but whereas I would consider something like, training sit-ups and crunches, having some sort of rotation or lateral flexion option, I'd consider those pretty unique and foundational to a training program. I think that if you're doing any heavy lifting at all, you're already training your erectors. And anything we're gonna be doing on top of that, like end range, lumbar flexion, Jefferson curls, those sorts of things. Those are going to be a little bit more nuanced discussions that we're going to get to later. So far, I've shared with you guys some of my favorite core exercises from a general training perspective. So if you're just looking to develop your six-pack, train your obliques, etc., I think the exercises that I shared with you guys, the crunch and leg raise, side bend, cable chop, all those exercises are going to be a great start to start developing a core training program. But if you're interested more in how core training can facilitate athletic performance, improve your heavy lifts like your squats and your deadlifts, help you navigate aches and pains, or use core training to improve your mobility, stick around, we're going to dig into some more advanced core training topics. One of the main reasons that a lot of people engage in core training is they want to train what's called trunk stiffness, or their ability to brace and keep everything tight and still, regardless of how much load is on their back or whatever. So to that end, a lot of people will pursue a category of training called core stability training, where essentially you're trying to resist movement in different directions, all dependent upon your ability to create pressure and just stay as still as possible. I'm going to talk about that entire category of exercises here, including the pros, cons, and some of the myths and misconceptions around core stability training, because I think it's one of the most misunderstood aspects in all of fitness. One of the most important misunderstandings, I think, about bracing and just your ability to create trunk stiffness is that it's isometric in nature. So isometric means no movement, right? So if I just try to hold this weight still in my arm, I'm doing a bicep isometric as opposed to a full range of motion exercise. Now, when it comes to the core and what the demands on the core are during something like a squat or a deadlift, the prevailing wisdom and idea is that the core functions isometrically and that the spine, the rib cage, etc., doesn't move during those exercises. And that's not exactly true. And I think that's very important as it relates to how we approach core stability training and how we approach training your brace to be as strong as possible. So the idea behind a lot of bracing exercises, core stability exercises, like the famous bird dog exercise, the idea behind these exercises is to try to move the spine as little as possible. So when you see people do this and they really arch their back to come up, that's considered a no-no with those exercises. You really want to try to keep everything as still as you possibly can. But when we compare that and the way that that is coached and the way that that is traditionally cued to what happens in the real world during a squat and a deadlift and other heavy exercises, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect, because as much as we try to keep our spine still, or as much as we try to make the core behave isometrically, research consistently shows that during a deadlift, for example, when you are picking a weight up off the floor, most people are going to be somewhere between 60 and 70% of their maximum achievable spinal flexion, and then approach more of a neutral position at the top. So that spinal flexion, that motion in the lower back, is really unavoidable. So no matter how much you train a bird dog or other core stability exercises, the real world exercises that you're worried about bracing so hard for aren't really isometric. They're what I would call kind of pseudo-isometric or quasi-isometric, where there's minimal movement, but that movement is still happening. So you have a ton of force, you're trying to keep things relatively still, but no matter how hard you try, there's still going to be some length change taking place. So when we have exercises like this, where we really are trying to minimize movement and to get that movement to be as minimal as possible, we're using less and less and less load so that we can control things very precisely. How much is that going to really translate to when loads are maximal and movement is inevitable? I'll leave that up to you to decide, but in my opinion, when it comes to training core stability or training for a brace, I think because heavy bracing in the real world is more of a quasi-isometric task in nature, I think that having quasi-isometric training makes a lot of sense. So we're going to get into that in a minute. But that doesn't mean I think that exercises like, the bird dog, for example, are completely worthless. It just means that I think there's a big difference between sort of low load motor control core stability exercises and high load isometric or quasi-isometric exercises that are going to be more functionally similar to the bracing that you're actually trying to get good at. Where I see the low load exercises shining is as a safe entry point for people who have recently been injured or lack a lot of movement confidence. Research generally shows that in the short term, especially for pain in the first 8 to 12 weeks, those low load motor control exercises tend to slightly outperform traditional training, probably because they're just lower load, they're easier, they're not as scary to perform, but long term, across multiple years for pain outcomes, they don't seem to be dramatically different overall. So that leads me to the second common misconception, I think the second biggest misconception I see in fitness, and that's the idea that the work that you would do to rehabilitate an injury is the same as the work that's going to prevent that injury from happening. I just don't think we can make a logical argument that prehab or using very low load exercises that we see used in the frailest patients, stroke recovery, spine surgery rehab. I don't think it makes sense that those exercises should be applied to high performance athletes as a means of injury prevention. The demands are just so different. So if you are someone who's just getting into this sort of thing, or you have some sort of pain or injury that you're working through, find that safe entry point for yourself, find something that you feel confident in. But if you are otherwise healthy, if you've been training for any length of time, I wouldn't make the mistake of thinking that those classic rehab exercises are something that you need to do to stop yourself from getting hurt. It's hard to talk about core stability training without bringing up Pilates and a lot of the messaging that has become mainstream by and large part because of Pilates around like the deep core stabilizers, doming versus hollowing, muscles like the transversus abdominis. A lot of those ideas have become popularized and kind of become mainstream because of the popularity of Pilates. And I think one of the most important things to discuss as it relates to some of the deep core muscles versus the more superficial core muscles is that distinction is fairly arbitrary and has more to do with just anatomical placement than important differences in how you actually approach training them. There's not a lot of great evidence that you have to do a specific exercise to train the transversus abdominis, for example. Even in high load tasks, it's relatively active. I think what has led to a lot of confusion is differences in timing. In that, in low load exercises, you're gonna see certain deep core muscles that are good at holding low levels of activation for a long period of time. You're gonna see those kind of turn on faster during low load exercises, but that doesn't mean that they're inactive or don't play an important role in heavier training as well. So what we really see in terms of, how does the deep core work in an exercise like this versus during a heavy squat or deadlift, it's not so much a difference in whether the muscle is being trained, it's the coordination of all of the muscles together. And that's really task specific. So doing one particular exercise like the 100 in Pilates or the bird dog or something like that, doing a low load exercise where you have a very particular timing and sequence of activation, that's not necessarily going to alter, nor would you want it to alter the pattern and timing that you see in heavier load exercises, because the coordination demands of different things are just going to be different. And being good at one does not mean that you're going to be good at another. So just like a lot of people that are great at heavy lifting might come into Pilates and struggle because the coordination demands are different, People that are great at Pilates might struggle to create the high levels of isometric or quasi-isometric tension required to do a heavy deadlift because, again, they're just different tasks. So they're all great ways to train the core. Some of them I think would be more time efficient than others. I think you can get great stimulus from 2 or 3 heavy sets of traditional core training as opposed to dedicating 45 plus minutes to a specific muscle group. But at the end of the day, it's all core training. There's going to be some overlap, but not a ton between them because they're just different things. I don't think that we should hold anything up on a pedestal as the ideal or most functional or most important way to train core, because it's all about training the core and training the body to be good at the things that you care about. So we've talked about how a lot of the traditional low load sort of motor control core stability exercises may not translate to true heavy lifting, more quasi-isometric bracing strategies where even when you try not to and you try to keep your spine as stiff as you can, when you go to actually get into a heavy squat or deadlift, there is inevitable spinal flexion, there's inevitable movement. So the muscles in your core are not truly contracting isometrically. They're still going to be changing length a little bit here and there under really, really heavy loads. So some exercises that are going to help you better prepare for that, if you're so inclined to double down on creating that sort of quasi-isometric trunk stiffness. Some of those exercises I'm going to share with you here. I think one of the biggest gaps between what people talk about and what you can do in training is when people talk about isometrics, they talk about how great they are for stability and this, that, and the other thing, but then they underload them and they end up being kind of relegated to rehab type of things, versus when you actually walk in the gym and you aren't injured and you are strong, if you want to train isometrically, you should do so because it's allowing you to get exposed to loads that you couldn't handle through a full range of motion or that you wouldn't be able to recover from under normal circumstances. So I think the best case for a healthy, strong athlete in terms of isometrics is going to be loading them up very, very heavy and doing either yielding or overcoming isometrics, which is what I'm going to show you next. I'm going to show you two of my favorite ones. One is going to be an isometric for trunk flexion. So again, the rectus abdominis that we talked about at the very beginning, but a heavy isometric version of that. And this is just basically a barbell rollout with holds. With heavy isos, you can do 30-second holds, 10-second holds. There's no magic number, but I like to work people towards very tough 3 to 5 second holds over time. So with the barbell rollout, what that's gonna look like is going further and further out until you find a really tough position that feels like near max effort. You're gonna try to hold for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you can relax, can reset, and you can do it again. Now, if you're able to come back from that, you can, but that means it's probably a little bit too easy, and you could do just reps, of rollouts. You could do a set of 10, set of 20. I think it's a fine exercise to approach traditionally, but I think it really shines as an isometric where you get out into a position that you can't come back from, something that's hard enough that you can't do reps of. You just hold for that 3 to 5 seconds, then relax and repeat. So to make that even tougher, you could go from the feet, go out as far as you can. Once you're there, hold, and then drop, reset, and repeat. I think that is generally going to translate better to your ability to maintain a really tight brace than something like just trying to stay really, really still. Again, unless that is your safe entry point right now. Similar to that kind of rollout isometric, I also like the side bend isometric. The obliques, even the QL, this muscle in your lower back, are underappreciated muscles when it comes to your ability to hold a tight brace. So if you do want to maximize that bracing ability, I think the isometric side bend is a great option. And you have two options for this, what we call yielding and what we call overcoming. Overcoming essentially means that you're pulling into something that you cannot lift the weight's not gonna move at all, and you're just gonna try as hard as you can. Yielding means we're gonna be just holding the weight statically and trying to not let it fall. Functionally, I think they're more similar than people give them credit for. I'm not super picky about which one you do. If anything, I kind of like really heavy yielding isometrics where you're holding the weight and trying not to drop it, because if you do start to drop it, you get good feedback that you're not trying as hard anymore. Whereas if you're just pulling into an immovable object and you start to let off the gas a little bit, unless you have some sort of force plate data or a crane scale or something, you're not really gonna have a good measure of what your output is compared to that yielding or holding variation. So to show you an example of what that would look like, that's heavy side bend isometric. I'm gonna go something really heavy, and then I'm just gonna hold for that 3 to 5 seconds, and then set it down. Now, at first, you might have a weight that you can do reps with, but like the barbell rollout isometric, I'd say the real goal of isometric training is exposure to loads that you otherwise couldn't handle. So I want you to find something that you can't do reps of, that you have to kind of cheat your way into position and then struggle to hold for those 3 to 5 seconds and then reset. Typically, in a workout, if I'm doing 3 to 5 second holds, I am looking for, anywhere from 60 to 120 seconds, 1 to 2 minutes of total tension. You can break that up any number of ways. One of my favorites is 5 by 5 seconds. I'll do 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off for 5 rounds, and I'll call that a set, and I'll do 2 or 3 sets. But like most things, there's no magic number, but that is a potentially good starting point. No core training video is complete without a discussion of loaded spinal flexion. Now, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about the spinal erectors and other muscles in the spine or around the spine that contribute to extension, because like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of redundancy and overlap in terms of what those muscles can all do. In most of the exercises we've talked about so far, including rotation and lateral flexion, you're gonna be training a lot of those muscles to some degree. Similarly, when you squat, deadlift, heavy lunges, whatever, all of those heavy exercises are gonna be a very significant stimulus to your spinal erectors through a moderate range of motion already. When you deadlift or squat, there's some inevitable degree of flexion, often approaching 60 to 70% of maximal flexion range of motion, all the way up to mostly a neutral position. So between some of the core exercises we've already talked about, your traditional heavy training, your muscles around your back are already getting absolutely hammered. So in terms of what we would layer onto that, I don't think you need as much. That being said, there are a few gaps that I think come up that you can address with just a handful of exercises. That's essentially going to be your end range flexion and your end range extension. Those tend to not get a lot of exposure in traditional training. So your end range spinal flexion is gonna be something like gaining strength in this fully rounded position, and your end range extension would be something like this in that fully shortened position. Realistically, kind of in the middle, this kind of range, you're probably gonna have quite a bit of strength and confidence through the training that you're already doing elsewhere, but you may feel a little bit more vulnerable way down there in that stress position, or you may feel a little bit weaker or lack good range of motion way up there at the top. So if I had to add on 2 exercises in terms of direct back extension or spinal extension work, it would be exposure to that deep flexion with something like the round back, kind of what I call just a back extension good morning. It's kind of a combination of the 2 exercises there, or something like this Jefferson curl, where you're trying to roll up one vertebrae at a time. Those are going to be great options for exposure to deeper degrees of flexion than you would typically see. In terms of training that end range extension, you can use a similar set up, and just really focus on getting as high as you can. Another great exercise for that in-range extension is things like a bridge or wheel, trying to lift off, get above that bench. Because you're already doing a lot for those muscles over the course of your regular training, I think you have to be a little bit more careful with total training volume with some of these exercises. If you're already squatting, deadlifting, doing a lot of the core exercises we've talked about, and then you try to add 10 sets a week of a Jefferson curl or a round back good morning, I think it can quickly become too much, as opposed to just strategically placing in, 1 or 2 sets once or twice a week, or pulling back a little bit on like your deadlift volume to make space for something like this and give yourself a little bit more variability across your program. So far, I've shown you guys a lot of full range of motion core exercises in 3 different planes of motion, and also some heavy isometric exercises if you want to double down on the idea of core stability or creating trunk stiffness. Now, in my view, if you're already lifting heavy, I don't think that you need a lot of training redundancy in your program. And for the average trainee, I'd suggest getting into more full range of motion training with your core work, as opposed to trying to make everything about creating isometric tension. That being said, I don't think that all isometric work is equally redundant. And there are some cases where I think isometric training can be somewhat unique, even in the context of a program that already has heavy lifting. And that's with long length or long range of motion isometrics for improving your mobility. Typically, if you're trying to improve your range of motion, you're going to need to accumulate some time under tension to make serious change. Yes, traditional full range of motion training can improve your mobility. Yes, you can do really heavy 3-second end range holds, but I think if you really want to make the most progress that you can at things like training the splits, for example, and other really serious mobility challenges, you're going to need something in your program that is more moderate load, sustained tension for a relatively long period of time, learning to relax into some of those end range positions. And that's equally true with some of this trunk work. So if you are someone that feels kind of locked up and tight in the trunk, and you want to improve your range of motion, specifically with like rotation, I think is a great one, where when you open up a little bit more range of motion, it just feels great. If that's something that is of interest to you, then consider an exercise like this. I have a moderate amount of weight on the cable stack here. I'm gonna rotate away from it a little bit so that the most challenging position is this kind of stretched or lengthened position. And I'm just gonna hold here at the end of my range of motion. And I'm gonna try to relax. There's gonna be a temptation to wanna rely on bracing for this. But if I can breathe and just hold this position for 30 to 60 seconds and approach a pretty high degree of effort by the end of it, I think this is a great way to get exposure and just spend more time learning to relax and own those end range positions. Once you're done and you start reaching that 30 to 60 second mark, just slowly come out of that position, relax, and then you can do the other side. What I like about that is it gets you exposure, like I said, to more time. You just get more comfortable in those positions, but it tends to not make you as sore as a lot of the really heavy full range work with the eccentric loading. So I find doing something like that, you feel really nice and open afterwards, often not quite as beat up. I don't want to oversell isometric work. I know we spent a lot of time on it in this video. I want to emphasize that if you just do the full range of motion exercises we started with, I think you're going to get great results. But I think it's worth knowing how to make the most out of some of the heavy isometric training exercises, when you might want to use kind of neutral or mid-range isos for 3 to 5 seconds versus longer end-range isos for 30 to 60 seconds if you do have more nuanced goals. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you're looking to see how I incorporate these exercises into a program, check out my workout programs. I've linked them in the description to this video, and be sure to continue to follow along, subscribe to the channel for more educational content just like this, short form content on Instagram @AlecBlennis, and again, workout programs, apparel, all that good stuff in the link below.